She came to Seoul to save a painting. She didn't know she was walking into the arms of a man who would burn the entire city down before he let her leave. The moment Seung-jun saw her standing in the rain outside his auction house, soaked to the bone, arguing with his security guard in broken Korean, something ancient and violent cracked open inside his chest. He hadn't felt anything in 11 years, not since the night he became the ghost. The man Seoul's most powerful people feared, respected, and never looked directly in the eye. But this woman, this beautiful, stubborn American woman with fire in her eyes and paint beneath her fingernails, looked right at him, and smiled like she had absolutely no idea who she was smiling at. Welcome to Unwrapped Korean Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe to Lock In. The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday evening, and Amara Cole was losing her mind on the sidewalk. Outside an auction house, she'd flown 14 hours from Chicago. She had a confirmed appointment, a letter of professional introduction from the Smithsonian Institute, and a very clear mandate. Authenticate and assess the Yi Dynasty landscape scroll that Han Auction House had quietly acquired from a private estate in Busan. Her museum needed that scroll, and right now, some enormous man in a black suit was blocking the entrance like a human wall and telling her, very politely but very firmly, that no appointments were scheduled for this evening. I have the letter right here. Amara held the soggy paper up. The rain was not helping. Dr. Amara Cole, Senior Art Authentication Specialist. Someone in your office confirmed this meeting 3 days ago. The guard said something in Korean she didn't catch. I don't need a translator, she said, even though she absolutely did. I need to see whoever is in charge. That would be me. The voice came from behind her. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need to raise itself because the world had learned to quiet down when it spoke. Amara turned. He stood under the covered entrance, hands in the pockets of a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual rent. Tall, absurdly, unfairly tall, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that caught the light from the doorway and held it like they owned it. There was a stillness about him that felt less like calm and more like the moment before an earthquake, like the world was waiting for him to decide whether to move. Seung-jun. She recognized him from the auction house's website. 40, maybe, the kind of handsome that made you forget what you were saying mid-sentence. He was looking at her the way people looked at rare things they were trying to decide whether to acquire. Dr. Cole, he said, in English, perfect accent-brushed English, you're very wet. Your guard won't let me in. My guard does what I tell him. He tilted his head slightly. Come inside. He turned and walked in without waiting to see if she followed. She followed. The interior of Han Auction House was the kind of beautiful that made Amara's heart ache professionally. Vaulted ceilings, climate-controlled display cases lining the walls, lighting so precise and deliberate it felt like standing inside a museum that had been designed by someone who actually understood beauty. Seung-jun led her through the main gallery without stopping, past staff who dropped their gazes as he walked by, through a set of polished doors, into a private viewing room where the scroll was waiting. It sat in a sealed case, unrolled and lit from above. The moment Amara saw it, everything else dissolved. Mountains in ink wash, a river suggesting movement without depicting it, the kind of brushwork that took 30 years to learn and a lifetime to perfect. She pressed her gloved fingers to the glass, leaning close, her brain already cataloging the paper's fiber density, the ink's oxidation patterns, the seal impressions in the bottom right corner. It's real, she said quietly, before she'd even run a single formal test. I know, Seung-jun said from behind her. She looked back at him. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her, not the scroll. How long have you known? Since I acquired it. Something shifted in his expression, brief and almost imperceptible. I wanted an outside confirmation, someone with no connection to Seoul's market. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because this scroll belonged to my grandfather. It was taken from my family in 1979. I wanted someone with no political reason to tell me the truth before I decide what to do with it. The room felt different after that. Amara straightened slowly, her professional composure warring with something more human. I'm sorry, she said, about your family. He looked at her for a long moment, as if the words had surprised him, as if he wasn't used to them. "Will you stay for tea, Dr. Cole?" he said finally, "while your clothes dry." She stayed for 3 hours. They talked about the scroll, then about the Yi Dynasty period in general, then somehow about Chicago winters and Korean winters and the specific loneliness of being in a city where you don't fully speak the language. Amara was good at conversation. It was part of her job, putting collectors and curators at ease, but this felt different. Seung-jun listened with his entire body, like whatever she said was worth keeping. He was also very careful to tell her almost nothing about himself. She noticed that, filed it away. When she finally left, stepping into a night that had stopped raining, her authentication work scheduled to begin the following morning, she told herself the flutter in her chest was professional excitement about the scroll. She was a spectacular liar. The next morning, she arrived to find a brand new umbrella hanging from the door handle of her hotel room. Matte black, no note, no name. The exact size and weight of a serious umbrella that someone had purchased while thinking specifically about the person who would use it. She stood there in the corridor for a full 30 seconds. Then she picked it up and went to work. Over the following 2 weeks, Amara conducted her authentication work in the private viewing room each day, and each day Seung-jun appeared. Never announced, never for long. He brought coffee without asking how she took it, which should have been presumptuous, but was always exactly right. 1 sugar, a splash of cream. He asked questions about her process that were sharper and better informed than anyone outside the field had a right to ask. He made her laugh twice, which was twice more than she expected. She learned things by accumulation rather than disclosure. He spoke 4 languages and pretended to speak 3. He owned 7 properties in 5 countries and slept in the penthouse above the auction house because, as far as she could tell, he didn't sleep much anyway. His staff moved around him with the kind of silent devotion that came from either great loyalty or great fear, and she couldn't always tell which. She also noticed the men who waited outside the building when he arrived. The way conversations stopped when he walked into rooms. The way even other powerful people in the rare moments she glimpsed him in the building's lobby, men in expensive suits, with the self-satisfied bearing of people who were used to being the most important person in the room, straightened slightly when they saw him. She asked her translator, a cheerful young woman named Bora, about it one afternoon. Bora's cheerfulness dimmed by several watts. "Mr. Han," Bora said carefully, "is a very important man in Seoul." "Important how?" "Many ways," said Bora and changed the subject. Amara found out on a Wednesday. She'd gone looking for a file she'd left in the secondary storage room and taken a wrong turn down a corridor she hadn't been shown. Through a half-open door, she saw 4 men seated around a table, not auction house staff, not the polished dealers and representatives she was used to seeing. These men wore their power differently, quieter, harder. At the head of the table sat Seung-jun. He was speaking in Korean, low and absolutely level, and whatever he was saying made a man twice his age press his lips together and nod with the expression of someone who had decided, wisely, not to argue. On the table between them was a photograph and a ledger, and something Amara's brain refused to fully process before she stepped back from the doorway. She found her file. She went back to the viewing room. She sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. Then she put on her gloves and went back to work, because the scroll still needed her, and she was professional to her bones. But she knew the pieces she'd been unconsciously collecting for 2 weeks arranged themselves suddenly and without mercy. Seung-jun was not just a collector. The ghost, a name she'd heard whispered twice in her hotel lobby with the same tone people used for bad, whether that was still 2 days out, was him. That evening, he appeared in the doorway of the viewing room at his usual time, carrying her coffee. She took it. She met his eyes. He looked back at her steadily, and she understood that he was waiting to see what she would do with what she now knew. "1 sugar, splash of cream," she said. "You've never once asked me." "You frown at anything too sweet," he said, "and you tip the cup toward the light when there's too much cream, checking the color. You watch me a lot." "Yes." The honesty of it landed differently than she expected. No pretense, no deflection. She looked down at the scroll, back up at him. "I finish authentication in 5 days," she said. I know. I'm going back to Chicago. Something moved through his face, so controlled, so brief, that if she'd blinked, she would have missed it. I know that too, he said. 4 days before her flight, Han Seung-jun took her to Bukchan Hanok village at dusk. She didn't know how it had happened exactly. One moment they were reviewing her preliminary authentication notes in his office. The next he was holding the door open and saying there was something she should see before she left Seoul. She told herself no at least 3 times on the way there, and apparently said yes with her entire body each time. The alleyways glowed warm and amber between traditional Hanok rooftops. He walked beside her with his hands behind his back and pointed out things she would have missed: a 19th century roof tile, a gate built to a specification that indicated the original owner was a court official, a persimmon tree that was older than either of them would ever be. You know this area well, she said. I grew up 2 streets from here. He paused at a low wall, looking out over the city's sprawl below. Not in the houses you're imagining, in the gaps between them. She watched his profile. In the fading light, the hardness that she'd grown used to had softened into something else. Not soft, exactly, more like the underneath of something, the thing that the hardness was protecting. Is this the part, she said carefully, where you tell me what you actually are? He turned to look at her. Would it change what you think of the person I am when I'm with you? The question hit her somewhere unguarded. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded as if that was more than he'd expected. Then let me show you the city a little longer before you decide. She should not have let him hold her hand on the walk back. She held it anyway. 3 days before her flight, a man appeared at the auction house asking for her. Amara met him in the lobby, mid-40s, well-dressed, Seoul National University professor badge clipped to his lapel. He introduced himself as Dr. Wu and said he'd heard she was authenticating the scroll and had some research that complicated the provenance question. He was charming and knowledgeable and kept finding small reasons to touch her arm as he spoke. She was aware, in the peripheral way you became aware of weather changing, that Han Seung-jun had appeared in the doorway across the lobby. She couldn't see his face clearly from that distance. She didn't need to. The air in the room had changed. Dr. Wu suggested dinner to continue their discussion. He smiled in the particular way of men who were accustomed to smiling and having it work. I appreciate the offer, Amara said, but I'll need anything research-related submitted in writing to the auction house directly. Dr. Wu's smile adjusted. He left. She walked across the lobby. Han Seung-jun had not moved from the doorway. He's not a professor, Seung-jun said quietly. His voice was perfectly even, but the stillness about him had gone very, very tight. I didn't think so, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You handled that yourself. I don't need handling, she tilted her head, but thank you for the concern. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more complicated than that. You are relentlessly inconvenient, he said. I've been told. 2 days before her flight, she found the envelope. It was in her hotel room, slid under the door. Inside, printed on clean paper, were 3 things: a full background profile on Dr. Wu, who was, in fact, an information broker employed by a rival collector trying to delay or discredit her authentication, a copy of the original 1979 estate registry proving the scroll's connection to the Han family, and a single handwritten line at the bottom. You deserve to know everything you're walking into, including me. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called the number she'd saved under Han Auction House Private, but had never used. He answered on the second ring. I read it, she said. Silence then, and I think, she said slowly, you should come tell me the rest in person. He told her everything that night. Not all at once, not cleanly, not without long pauses where he looked out the window at Seoul's lights and she waited. But he told her. The organization he'd built from the ruins of his grandfather's legacy. The empire of leverage and information and controlled power that held Seoul's darker machinery in a grip that kept it, paradoxically, from consuming itself. The things he'd done. The name people called him. She listened. She asked 2 questions, both specific, both fair. When he finished, the room was quiet. You've been watching over me, she said, since I arrived. Yes. That's, she pressed her lips together. That's somewhere between protective and alarming. I know. She looked at him. Sitting across from her, all of that enormous controlled power stripped back to something quiet and waiting, like a man standing in front of a door that he'd built himself and wasn't sure he was allowed to open. I leave in 2 days, she said. I know that too. Seung-jun, she said his name and watched him go very still. Why did you show me this city? Why the coffee every morning and the umbrella and the why? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice stripped of everything practiced, because you looked at the scroll and you saw something worth saving in it, and then you looked at me. He stopped, started again. No one looks at me the way you do, like I am also something worth understanding. The distance between them was not very large. She closed it. What followed was not something that needed to be spoken aloud afterward. What needed to be spoken was this. When she woke the next morning, light coming thin and silver through the curtains, Amara felt the specific terror of a woman who had made a decision with her heart that her head hadn't been consulted on. She was leaving tomorrow. She had a life in Chicago, a career, an apartment, a whole self that existed outside this city and this impossible man. She dressed quietly. She told herself she was being sensible. She left before he woke up. She was at the airport. She had checked her luggage. She was sitting in the departures lounge with a coffee she wasn't drinking, and she was telling herself, quite firmly, that this was the correct and rational decision when her phone rang. Not a number she recognized. Dr. Cole, a woman's voice. Smooth, Seoul-accented English, polite in the way of someone who'd learned politeness as a weapon. I represent certain interests who would very much like you to share your authentication findings before they become public record, particularly the provenance documentation Mr. Han provided you. Amara's hand tightened on the phone. I don't share client confidential documentation. That would be unfortunate, said the woman. For you specifically, given that you've become something of a personal interest to a man with a great many enemies. We would hate for your professional reputation or your safety to become collateral in his difficulties. The line went dead. Amara sat very still in the departures lounge for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up her carry-on, walked to the desk, and asked to have her luggage recalled. Han Seung-jun was standing in the center of his office when she walked back in, and the expression on his face when he saw her was the most unguarded thing she'd ever seen on another human being. Relief and fury and something aching behind both of them, all of it there for exactly 2 seconds before he pulled it back under control. She told him about the call before he could speak. He went very quiet. The particular quiet she now understood was not peace but the moment before a decision. Go home, Amara, he said, low, hard. Take the next flight. What's coming is not something you should be near. She called me, Amara said. I'm already near it. I will handle. Tell me who they are. Amara. Tell me. She crossed the room until she was right in front of him, forcing him to look at her instead of past her. You told me everything last night. Don't take it back now because you're scared. His jaw tightened. I am not scared. You're terrified of something happening to me. I can see it. She held his gaze. So stop trying to protect me by pushing me away and tell me what we're dealing with so we can deal with it together. Something in him gave way. Not broke, gave way, like a door that had been pushed too long from the wrong side finally opening outward. Sit down, he said. This will take a while. The Yon Group. That was the name. Old money, old connections, a dynasty of legal and illegal influence that had spent 30 years building Seoul's political infrastructure from below, the way termites built inside walls. Han Seung-jun had spent 8 of those years quietly dismantling them, acquiring their debts, flipping their allies, building a case file that he'd been planning to deliver to the one federal prosecutor in the country he was certain Yon money hadn't reached. The scroll had been the trigger. It had belonged to his grandfather, yes, but it had also spent 40 years in Yon family hands, acquired through the same criminal network that had destroyed his family. Its provenance was a thread that, properly pulled, unraveled a great deal. They'd sent Dr. Wu to delay or discredit the authentication. When that failed, they'd moved to Amara directly. They won't hurt you, Seung-jun said, and then stopped himself. Honesty had become a habit with her, and it was too late to unlearn it. They will try to use you as leverage, as a way to reach me. So give me to someone who can keep me safe while you handle them. He looked at her. I don't want you out of my sight. Then keep me in your sight. She held his gaze. I trust you. I know that's possibly insane, but I do. He crossed the room in 3 steps and kissed her. Not gently. Like a promise and a problem all at once, his hands framing her face with that devastating, careful strength, as if she were the most valuable thing in any room he'd ever been in. When he pulled back, his forehead dropped to rest against hers. Don't leave again, he said, very quiet. Not like that, not without telling me. I panicked, she said. I know, a breath, so did I. The next 72 hours were not gentle. Seung-jun moved them to a secondary location, not a safe house in the hiding sense, more a reinforced apartment in Mapogu where the security was built into the architecture. Amara worked. She finished her authentication report with the focus of someone who decided that the best response to being used as a pawn was to become extremely competent and fast. She documented everything, cross-referenced everything, built the scroll's provenance case so thoroughly that it could not be challenged. Seung-jun moved around her like whether present, watchful, occasionally handing her food she'd forgotten to eat. He made 3 calls she wasn't meant to hear and 2 that she was. He was, she realized, including her, showing her the machinery as it moved. On the second evening, she found him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, standing at the window with a glass of water, looking out at the city. She came to stand beside him. Tell me what you're thinking, she said. That I've been in this city 22 years, he said. I know every street, every building, every leverage point and weak wall. I built most of them. He paused. I have never had something in this city I actually wanted to keep. She took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands with the expression of a man who had been handed something he didn't have a procedure for. I'm not a thing to keep, she said, but I'm choosing to stay, that's different. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. Just that. The reverence in it made her breath catch. Yes, he said, it is. On the 3rd day, the Yon group made their move. It was coordinated and it was swift, a leaked story to 3 media outlets simultaneously, accusing Han Seung-jun of forging the scroll's provenance documentation, with Amara named as either a co-conspirator or a dupe depending on the version. By 8 in the morning, it was on 4 news sites. By 10, her museum director in Chicago was calling her phone. She didn't answer the museum director. She sent him her completed report, 112 pages, fully annotated, with supporting documentation that had been time-stamped and filed with the Korean Cultural Heritage Administration the previous afternoon. Because Han Seung-jun had thought of that. He'd suggested it on day 1, quietly, without explaining why, and she'd done it because her process was always thorough and she'd seen no reason not to. The leak collapsed within 6 hours. You cannot accuse someone of forging documentation that was independently verified and filed with the government before the story was written. At noon, the federal prosecutor Seung-jun had spent years cultivating. A compact, serious woman named Jang who received the complete Yon Group case file delivered to her office that morning, issued a statement announcing a formal investigation. By evening, the Yon Group's chairman was canceling international travel. Amara watched it unfold from Seung-jun's office. He stood beside her, not triumphant, too controlled for that, but something looser in his posture than she'd ever seen, like a knot working itself free. Is it over? She said. This part, he exhaled. The rest takes time, courts, proceedings, but the teeth are pulled. She leaned into his side, and his arm came around her without hesitation, pulling her against him. I need to call Chicago, she said. I know. And I need to figure out what I'm doing. He was quiet. About the job, she clarified. About where I'm based, because she stopped, found the honest words. I'm not ready to be on a different continent from you. The arm around her tightened. There are 3 museums in Seoul that would take you immediately, he said. I have not suggested this because I did not want you to feel pressured. She tilted her head up to look at him. Han Seung-jun. Yes. Did you do background research on Seoul Museum positions for me? They send me their board reports, I noticed. She laughed, actual laughter, the kind she hadn't expected to feel in the past 3 days. He looked at her with that not-quite smile, something warm moving through the dark eyes that she was fairly sure very few people ever got to see. She extended her visa, She called Chicago. She took the position at the National Museum of Korea, which did not, technically, have anything to do with Han Seung-jun's influence, except in the 3 ways that it did. She decided she was fine with that. The restoration lab was extraordinary. She moved into the apartment below his penthouse because she was practical and it was available and it was not, she told herself, a symbolic step. 3 months later, she was standing in that apartment's bathroom looking at a pregnancy test. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long time. Her hands weren't shaking. That surprised her. She felt more than anything a deep and complicated and terrifying warmth. She'd been careful, they'd been careful. Bodies made their own decisions sometimes. She thought about the man 2 floors above her who had built an empire to reclaim his grandfather's memory and dismantled it again because it had started to consume the things he actually valued, who brought her coffee calibrated to exactly her preference every morning and had quietly learned to exist in the same space as another person after spending 20 years not doing that, who woke up from nightmares and reached for her hand in the dark. She thought about what kind of father he might be. Given the chance. She picked up her phone. He arrived in 4 minutes, which meant he'd come immediately. She showed him the test without saying anything. Han Seung-jun went very still in the way that was not stillness, but everything at once pressing against the surface of him. She watched his face do something complicated and unguarded and completely uncontrolled, the rarest thing she'd ever seen from him. Then he sat down on the edge of the tub beside her, and he took her hand, and he pressed it flat over his heartbeat, which was doing something far less controlled than his face. "Tell me what you want," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Whatever you want, Amara, tell me and it's yours." "I want to know how you feel," she said. He turned to look at her. His eyes were bright in a way she'd never seen. "Like I have been given something I do not deserve," he said, "and I will spend the rest of my life becoming someone who does." She exhaled. "That's a good answer." "I've been practicing." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair, and they sat like that for a while. 2 people in a bathroom in Seoul, figuring out the rest of everything. They married quietly 6 months later, in a small ceremony in the garden of a restored hanok in Bukchan, 2 streets from where he'd grown up in the gaps between buildings. Bora cried. Prosecutor Jang came, which surprised Amara and seemed to quietly move Seung-jun in ways he wouldn't articulate. His right hand, a taciturn man named Park who Amara had spent 4 months being slightly afraid of, gave a toast that was 4 sentences long and contained. Apparently, 3 jokes that made every Korean person in attendance laugh hard enough to wipe their eyes. Amara wore deep gold. Seung-jun wore charcoal and looked at her like she was the only solid thing in a room that had been uncertain his whole life. He held her hand through the entire ceremony. She suspected he would have held it through dinner too if she hadn't pointed out she needed both hands to eat. "You are," he said, very quietly over dessert, "the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me." "You love it," she said. He looked at her with all that complicated, ferocious, enormous feeling he'd spent 40 years not having anywhere to put. "Yes," he said, "I do." Their daughter was born in April, in a private hospital room where Seung-jun held Amara's hand so hard she had bruises for 2 days, which she did not tell him about because the expression on his face when they placed the baby in his arms, shock and terror, and a love so sudden and vast it had nowhere to go but outward, was something she wanted to preserve undiluted. He sat in the chair beside her bed and held his daughter with the careful precision of a man handling the most valuable thing he'd ever been trusted with. The baby had his dark eyes and Amara's curls, and the particular frown of someone who had opinions about everything and would be expressing them shortly. "She's going to be a problem," Amara said. "Yes," said Seung-jun, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had made peace with a particular kind of beautiful difficulty. He looked up at Amara, and between them passed something wordless and whole, the sum of 14 months, a scroll and a storm and a dead empire and a leap they'd both taken without knowing what was at the bottom, and everything they'd found there. Outside, Seoul ran its ancient, relentless, glittering course. Inside, the ghost was gone. What remained was a man, his wife, and a daughter who would grow up knowing that the most powerful thing her father had ever done was learn how to stay. Some men are built by violence and unmade by love. And the love is always the harder thing, the choice made daily, in the small hours, in the ordinary spaces between catastrophe. But it is also the only empire worth keeping. If this story lived in your chest, besties, you know what to do, like, share, subscribe, and drop in the comments. Was Seung-jun's need to keep Amara close an obsession, or the first real thing he ever felt? I want every opinion. Don't miss what comes next. Hit that notification bell and stay in the Ruthless Romance family.